Before we start the session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and the traditional custodians of the land from which you all join us today. And I know, Janine, you're in Queensland. Amanda and Amy may well be in the same lands as myself, but I'd also like to pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be on the line as well. So we've come to the end of the conference, basically. This last session is, we hope we end on a high note, because it's the a little bit about government, a little bit about statutory organisations and what government can do in reimagining gender in emergency management, and maybe even putting our own spin on what that actually means to yourselves as individuals, or your organisations as statutory or government bodies, national or statewide, as we talk about gender and emergency management. It has been hectic, like I said. We haven't got Andrew with us. Andrew Crisp is obviously in a high decision-making mode with other leaders in the state as we progress into what we think, and others might know better than me, but a lockdown for the next 7 days possibly. But I will introduce this. We go around. Amy Prendergast. Hi, Amy, the acting CEO of Respect Victoria. We have Amanda Leck, who's a friend and also an executive director of AIDA, the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience. And in lieu of those other two leaders, these are big boots to fill, this Janine Taylor. Janine Taylor is a friend of mine from Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. And she's come in at the last minute, and hopefully we might get a drop in from someone else. We'll see how we go. I have a bio in front of me, but I'm not going to do you a disservice by reading it out, because once again, it's always time critical, Janine, and your bio can go on for a while. So welcome to the three of you. What I'd like to ask people to do is, if they have any questions, to populate those into the Q&A box, contribute to the chat as we go along, and we'll see how this pans out this session. As I said, apologies once again from Tony Pearce, the Inspector General of Emergency Management in Victoria, because he's also digressed into those important talks about COVID-19 with Andrew. But I'm sure we won't be wanting at the end of this session. We can go over because it is the end, but we may not. Look, I also want to introduce our first video speaker, which is Maureen Fordham. Now, Maureen we spoke at the 2018 Gender and Disaster gig at the MCG. Well-respected guru of all things gender and disaster. We have 3 a.m. in the UK at the moment, so Maureen's done 3 minutes or so to video, and we'll play that now if we can.
Thinking about government initiatives, it makes me ask these questions. So if we know so much about gender concerns in disasters, and we do know a lot now, why don't we see the changes we expect? Why do we still have the same meetings and ask the same questions? And given the scale of gender-based violence in disasters in the everyday, why do we not have any or more public inquiries or official investigations where we can expect serious consideration for political and behavioural change? And thinking about the staffing levels in gender terms, why no far more serious investigation of this, not just to look for evidence of whether there is gender skewed staffing, because we know there is, but why can we not make some real change in this? And I think actually Australia has done a lot more than many other countries in the world in this particular area. But until we're at a 50-50 split here, we haven't done it yet. And I just wonder whether, given the value of this particular conference and the fact that there is this potential for it to repeat in following years, can't we have this conference as a place for a biennial reckoning? So what have been all the concrete changes from government and across the sector? And it's the opportunity for people to stand up and to be questioned on what changes they have made occur in the intervening time. So sorry to rush through all of that with a lot of wordy slides, but I just wanted to make those few points. And I'm very sorry I'm not there in person, and I do wish I were. And I hope to see you again in the future, where perhaps we can have the biennial reckoning. And thank you, everybody, and thank you for the invitation.
And just following on from Maureen's presentation earlier in the conference, she asked the question why a lot, and she's been in the space a long time. So as I said, she was in Australia in 2018, and she is desperate for the discourse to continue. And in doing so, she wants to know why we are either still treading water, why there still isn't what, you know, our research tells us how the emergency services sectors should change, say, for instance. We can ponder on that. We can't ask Maureen any questions face to face, which is fine, but we can put them into the chat and maybe others can be able to chip in. Look, firstly, once again, apologies on behalf of the Emergency Management Commissioner, Andrew, who can't be with us. But I'd like to throw to Amy first, came off the rank. And Amy, if you'd like to say a little bit about Respect Vic, the work that we've done, or that the GAD pod rather have done with Respect Vic, but tell us more about how, as a statutory organisation, COVID particularly and disasters have affected the communities from the perspective of Respect Vic.
Great, thanks very much, Steve. I might just begin speaking by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge that today is the start of Reconciliation Week, and the theme is more than a word, reconciliation takes action. And I think that's just important to call out if we're talking about meaningfully addressing inequality in this context, in this discussion. I understand there's a lot going on for emergency services this morning, but really pleased to be here on behalf of Respect Vic, representing for this discussion. For those who don't know, Respect Victoria is the statutory authority leading the prevention of family violence and violence against women efforts, which I'll just call family violence prevention today to keep it simple. And our focus is on stopping the violence before it starts by looking at the cultural conditions that lead to this. As Steve noted, noting there's sort of limited time today and others to speak, I thought it would be good to focus a little bit on some of the insights we gained during the COVID-19 pandemic, and a really important reminder, I think, for us all today as well. What we do know is from disasters like COVID-19 and bushfires that the fault lines of systemic inequality increase. And so what this means is that many of the factors that put people at higher risk during disasters and like COVID-19 and its social and economic fallout are the same kind of factors that put people at higher risk of family violence. And we've seen that in the data. In fact, during the peak of the crisis last year, there was a 9.4% increase to reports, and Victoria recorded its highest reporting on family violence ever, and this is quite extraordinary coming out of the Royal Commission and the very high rates already. Some of this may be due to changes in trust in system, but nevertheless we know that disasters impact on this strongly. And what we know is that, of course, family violence and violence against women is driven by inequality, so gender inequality, discrimination, marginalisation, in a variety of forms. And so what we did during the COVID-19 pandemic was to have a look at what are the particular impacts of this disaster on the drivers of violence, and we found some interesting things. Firstly, we found that ageism, social isolation and poorer physical and mental health during COVID last year, and that this increased their risk of elder abuse. We found that LGBTQI Victorians, particularly those with poorer health, social and economic inequalities, faced increased challenges during this time, and this put them at higher risk of experiences of family violence across a variety of ways. And we also conducted research into the impact of the pandemic on the primary prevention workforce itself, which is also highly gendered. And we found two main things. One, that women who were practitioners were experiencing both the gendered impacts of working during the pandemic, like the uneven distribution of labour in the home and care duties, and also being directed away from primary prevention work into more response-focused activities. And this is problematic for a number of reasons. Essentially, without intervention, family violence for a diverse range of communities is likely to increase, as we've discovered, not just in the immediate context of the disaster, but over the medium to long term. So it has longer term ramifications. And so it's really important for us that I suppose the primary prevention aspect continues during a disaster. And what this means is that I guess that it's continued to be addressed across the whole community and further than family violence practitioners, that police, emergency services, health, and community services, justice, education and other sectors really address the discrimination and help avoid or reduce the impact of that during a disaster context. I can talk to some particular examples, Steve, perhaps later if there's time in the questions, but I'd just end by saying one of the most important things that we can do, and Maureen talked about this in her video, but is really to address seriously the issue of representation. And that means women, Aboriginal women, Aboriginal people, older people, people with a disability, LGBTQI+A Victorians, are represented in positions of leadership in disaster and emergency management authorities. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. It's interesting that, and it does beg a belief that at a time when people are most vulnerable, that's when they become increasingly more vulnerable. And it's an indictment on the jingoistic sort of, you know, the adage that it's un-Australian, but I think it's not just Australian. It's a human phenomena, where, you know, we know that through, you know, during bushfires and floods, for instance, there's occurrences of looting, you know, that goes on. So not specific to any, you know, particular group at all, but just human behaviour, you know. What do we do? What are we going to say? But it would be good to get some examples at the end. Amy, absolutely, we'll come back. Amanda Leck, I'd like to have a chat, Amanda, and learn a little bit more about AIDA's work, and particularly the connection between, well, the relationship with the GAD-POD. We acknowledge the fact that AIDA is a supporter, a sponsor of the conference as we move ahead, and a little bit about the Champions of Change program that I know you're across.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity, and good morning, everyone. So the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience is really pleased to partner with the GAD-POD for this conference, but also for your previous conference in 2018. And before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and where I am. That's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledging that today is Sorry Day. Look, as I said, we've been pleased to partner with you because our mandate is really around building resilience at that whole of community, government, working with the private sector, working with academia and so on. So we have quite a broad mandate. And I think that what you're trying to do through the GAD-POD and your colleague, Steve, is to, you know, really put on the forefront that whole issue of gender and disaster and inclusion. And when I think more broadly around our sector, I think it's really interesting to reflect how much emphasis goes into the response phase of emergency management, and funding also goes to that phase, when we know that we fundamentally need to shift the whole dialogue to strengthening community resilience at the local level. Now, if we do that for, you know, just general life, people will have a better life. They will be more socially connected. They will be less isolated. A lot of these issues around socioeconomic disadvantage will be addressed. And then during disaster, as a society, we reap the benefits of those investments, if you like, in people and communities, because we know that communities that are stronger and more connected recover much quicker than communities that have less capacity for those things. So an investment in resilience is really an investment in better recovery and an investment in inclusion and diversity. So for those of you unfamiliar with AIDA, we are fully funded by the Commonwealth Government, and it's a partnership of AFAC, the National Fire and Emergency Services Council, and the Australian Red Cross. So specifically, what have we done with GADPOD? Well, we've sponsored 20 places to this conference so that students, volunteers and community members were able to attend. And if any of you are online now, I give a shout out to you and hope that you've enjoyed what has been a terrific conference program with many speakers really highlighting key insights on gender and disaster. And Steve, I particularly enjoyed that opening panel session at the Wheeler Centre. I thought that was an outstanding lineup that you had. As I said earlier, we also partnered previously with GADPOD. We've delivered 2 Recovery Matters webinars with the GADPOD team, one on family violence and disasters and one on LGBTIQA+ experience in disasters and recovery, and we held that during Pride Week. So those are available to view online, and I have a colleague online who's popping the link into the chat as I speak, so that anyone who would like to, do a catch up who didn't participate in those, they're available to view now as webinars. For the 2018 conference, we also produced a monograph, which was a themed edition of the Australian Journal of Emergency Management. And again, those papers are available online on the AGM site. So, I suppose where I sit, I like to kind of take a big picture to this issue, Steve. So we know that, as I said earlier, we've really got to shift the entire conversation to disaster risk reduction as an input to building resilience. And that means, funding, resources, effort across the whole of society. Because what's the definition of stupidity? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So our work is guided by international frameworks, including the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And I think many people online would know that Australia is in fact a signatory to Sendai. And that has informed the Australian policy context, which is the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, which COAG, so that's all the governments in Australia, adopted this framework in March of 2020. So there is an overarching policy domain that drives this work from the top down. Now we know that it's about, bottom up, locally led resilience initiatives, but it's also about top down strategic guidance, funding, money, effort, resources that will get us somewhere in this conversation. So a guiding principle of Sendai is that disaster risk reduction requires an all of society empowerment and inclusive, accessible and non-discriminatory participation, paying special attention to people who are disproportionately affected by disasters, especially the poorest. So we know, even in the Australian context, the analysis after the Black Saturday fires showed that women and children died in greater numbers, and often because of their gender, in terms of their ability to choose to leave early, as many wanted to do, or the fact that they were responsible for caring and carrying young children as they fled those fires. So women across the world experience disasters in a more profound way than do men. The Sendai framework states that gender, age, disability and cultural perspectives should be integrated in all policies and practices, and women and youth leadership should be promoted. Priority 4 focuses on building back better, and I think that's where we're going. If you look at the work being done in Queensland, and I acknowledge Janine online, through the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, they're doing a power of work in building back better. Now that's across infrastructure, but how do we build back better across communities and social domains, and not just with that focus on infrastructure? And I know that QRA are leading a piece of work around resilience planning at that local level. So I really commend Queensland for their work there. We know that empowering women and persons with disabilities to publicly lead and promote gender equitable and university accessible response, recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction approaches is key to this. If we think about the Royal Commission that we've just recently gone through last year into national natural disaster arrangements, the final report particularly mentioned the role of women in relation to family violence, the health needs of women and pregnant women in evacuation centres, and the role of Indigenous women in land management. There is also a national breastfeeding strategy, which was released in 2019, which highlights the health needs of women, obviously as breastfeeding mothers, in evacuation centres. And that is actually referenced in one of ADA's handbooks, the Health and Disaster Management Planning Handbook. ADA is also about to start a program of work to review the Evacuation Planning Handbook in response to the Royal Commission recommendations around evacuation. And we will certainly be including those cross-cutting themes of inclusion, diversity across all of its domains, with strategic guidance for the sector with regard to how to do effective disaster and evacuation planning as it relates to issues around disasters as well, and gender. I know I don't have a lot of time, but I just wanted to particularly mention the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection. Some of you would be familiar with those documents. The strategic guidance that I've described earlier through Sendai, that is actually, if you like, brought to life through the development of these national principles that are informed by research and evidence. And they are included in all of our handbooks on such topics as community engagement, land use planning for disaster resilient communities. We're working on a disaster resilience education handbook at the moment to support education for young people in school settings in particular. And so anyone can access those handbooks and the companion documents that support them. They provide strategic, practical guidance on how to do some of the things that have been discussed during this conference. How to take that, inclusion lens to everything you do, be it engaging with communities or developing evacuation plans or, working on emergency management planning. So that guidance is available for everyone. And before I close, I did just want to touch on that dimension, if I could, around emergency management or emergency services, Steve. So as I said, ADA is delivered in a partnership between AFAC and the Red Cross. And so AFAC signed up to be Champions of Change some 3 years ago. This is Elizabeth Broderick's program, and the senior leaders across the sector, so that's 32 commissioners and chief officers across the sector, have made a commitment to be part of this Champions of Change. There are now reports available on the AFAC website where we track and measure data. So we're looking at, gender inclusion metrics in particular, and representation of women. I think someone earlier, Amy, spoke about leadership. We've got to get the right people into leadership positions. And if we don't actively recruit, for gender and inclusion priorities, we will never have leaders leading our fire and emergency services that represent a balanced gender perspective. So we've made some progress. Progress is slow. I think Stuart gave a presentation, Stuart Ellis, the CEO, at the beginning of this conference. Progress is slow. It is accelerating in some states and jurisdictions, which I'm very pleased to note. And this year, the focus will be on sponsorship, succession planning and recruitment, and pay equality and data, and intersectionality in the workplace. So each year, the Champions of Change has a key focus area, as well as continuing to measure those key data points and report publicly on our progress. So as I said, progress is slow, but we are, striding to make efforts across this area. Thanks very much.
I'm not sure about the slow progress, Amanda, because you're well and truly on the map. And ADA's done some really proactive work intra-agency wise, nationally. So, I mean, it's just great to see that particularly, the concepts of intersectionality that is kind of, they're foreign concepts to emergency management unless it gets unpacked in a really concerted way by leaders, basically, of organisations. So thanks, Amanda. I want to throw now and I want to pause for a second and just say thanks so much for my long time colleague now and dear friend Janine Taylor from Queensland Fire and Emergency Services for taking up a last minute request to fill in a hole, for want of a better word, that was left with the inability of Tony Pearce, the Inspector General Emergency Management, and Andrew Crisp, the Emergency Management Commissioner, who are both tied up in COVID talks this morning, and particularly knocking on the door of Assistant Commissioner Steve Smith, and Steve, with no notice whatsoever, coming online to actually share a little bit of your insights as a leader in QFES. And we will, mark my word, make your bios available, and certainly make the recording of the, and I'm taking a bit of a liberty here, but certainly take availing the recordings of the conference to you both for your generosity here this morning at the close of what's been a really important gig. So thanks, Steve, and thanks, Janine. What I'd like to do is firstly introduce Steve, and say, and I'd like to ask you a couple of things about your role, Steve, because to me it's a role that is kind of a blank slate in a roundabout way. Assistant Commissioner of People at QFES. Can you explain a little bit more about your role?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, and thanks, Janine, for the opportunity on short notice. Really appreciated. So look, QFES People was sort of is an amalgam of everything to do with people in we're about an organisation of approximately 45,000 people, spread across obviously a very distributed, geographically diverse state. We've got combination of fire and rescue service, rural fire service, state emergency service, emergency management, and we've got a support and corporate service, which relative to our size is very small. And all of those are essential elements of us delivering the services the community needs and expects. The QFES People is sort of goes from attraction and recruitment and onboarding through training and development throughout their career, creates the ongoing support mechanisms for workplace health and safety, sort of psychological safety and support, our injury management, return to work elements, complaints management, development, cultural planning, and all of those elements. So it's really broad mandate. We sort of call it the people life cycle within the organisation. And it sort of brings, I suppose, the focus and attention of a range of people onto how we behave and what our practice is on a day-to-day basis. One of the things that we're focused on at the moment is increasing the language and attention to our values, and that driving our decision-making and actions at an individual level and at a collective level through the organisation. And in doing that, creating a sense of belonging, which is, you know, a desire for everyone in the workplace. We attract really great people, and we've got to, though we attract really great people, we've got to make sure that more people understand the opportunities that exist within, you know, fire and emergency services to provide meaningful work, meaningful engagement, either in a paid or volunteer sense, and the opportunities that exist from that. So I think there is a sense out there that there are limitations in some areas. We've got to do more to sort of encourage a broader understanding of that. And I think from that, we're hoping that we realise not just, you know, great people joining us, but they're strongly engaged with us as an organisation. And through that, they're more productive, they're more engaged, and community outcomes are stronger for it.
Thanks, Steve. That's a great overview of what you do, and it's the belonging theme is something that resonates there. I'd like to talk a little bit to Janine, who will pivot the camera towards her now, and speak a little bit about the Allies of Inclusion program, because I know that that's been you know, lauded as I would say best practice. Some may say promising practice, but certainly in the work that the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC has done and in Vic Uni into diversity and inclusion in organisations, fire services particularly, Allies is held up there, Janine. So tell us a little bit about what makes it different.
I guess what we've been working on with Allies is to create our own social capital within QFES, I suppose. So having people connected and networked with a focus on the values, as Steve mentioned, but then how do we get them invested in making a difference at that place where they are? And one of the first things we do when we're talking about Allies and we're talking with people who are interested in the program is we sort of redefine what diversity means. So, you know, it's really important language and what we understand with words are vitally important. So when we say diversity, we mean everyone and all the diversity, the difference that they bring. And that kind of creates a bit of stunned silence in the room, because a lot of people connect diversity, the word diversity, with underrepresentation. So when we peel away that notion and discuss, we absolutely need to understand underrepresentation in our organisation. We need to come up with some really smart activities and plans and strategies to understand the underrepresentation, but then sort of work towards doing better in that space. But it doesn't equal diversity. And I think when we start the conversation with that and make diversity about everyone, it creates an opportunity for people to think differently. So that's where we start with the program. I also, we talk about that old chestnut of, reflecting the community. And often even the word reflect, we think visually. But if we think about that diversity of being, that people bring creates perspective, it's really the diversity of perspective that we want to reflect. And in that way, we're better able to understand the community's needs or how to connect with them. So those are two little parts of the program that I think are important. And I have some whys, why people want to get involved, but it's really creating conversations, connecting us to our values, connecting us to our communities, which, helps in that resilience, as Amanda mentioned before. So I also like to say, when you get a call from Steve at 9:30 in the morning, a message saying, call me quickly, you'll be flying by the seat of your pants. So thankfully, AC Smith was able to jump in and bring the level that was left behind by your current COVID situation. So thanks, Steve.
Well, I know that the conversation we had this morning was private, and that you will relay to the Assistant Commissioner that, a leader, in my eyes, is someone who can step into the breach like this and talk about a subject matter like this on short notice. So thanks again, Steve. Back to you in a second. I want to ask Amy, firstly, about prevention, Amy. I mean, prevention, in fact, is large in the fire services continuum, the prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. So, we're response-orientated organisations, so we haven't really been in that recovery space, but we know that recovery is so important now. It's long-lasting, so the response can be quite rapid in the scheme of things. So, and just to draw that structural discrimination into the prevention space, how can we as emergency responders, utilise the services or advice from organisations, statutory organisations like Respect Big?
Thanks, Dave. And really enjoyed that discussion, Janine, about what diversity actually means and about diversity of perspectives. And I think that's super important. I think there's probably a couple of things to look at. One is, this is about organisations, government, industries doing work in their own backyard, first of all, about what this actually means. And so, I think diversity of leadership is one visible thing that we'll see that's different when the organisations have kind of done that work and assessed where they're at and where they need to shift. And I think everyone needs to do that work. Excuse me. And I think in terms of that work in your own backyard, that's workplace adaptations. That's looking at flexible working arrangements. That's looking at working from home. It's looking at policies that encourage men to take on equal share around labour, gendered unpaid labour and care work in particular. And it's policies and structures and systems which look at women's financial security as well, all the things we know that can leave people vulnerable to family violence and in disasters. And I think the other aspect is once sort of that work's done in organisations' own backyard, you get a much more sophisticated service response system. So some of the things, we'd be wanting to see would be really specific direct support to those communities who are most at risk. And if we think about the last year, that's definitely migrant support communities in Melbourne, in Victoria, women on temporary visas in particular, had an enormous impact in terms of family violence and just generally in terms of financial and social support and being vulnerable in that context. So the service system should look much more sophisticated, I think, around that in the future. There's some work then that would happen around messaging when you've got people in leadership positions and a whole range of things happening. So messaging around people with disabilities or older people wouldn't necessarily be promoting them as much as burdens or, you know, passive victims in disaster context, but there'd be a range of different things, whether it be assistive technologies, services, structures, things in place, and a much more sophisticated response. Same messaging to sort of families would include messaging to rainbow families and people from diverse gender and sexual backgrounds. And I think, yeah, just that the communication would be much stronger and more visible. And I talked earlier about Reconciliation Week, but there's a big bit there to do from organisations' own work, but then in terms of the service response around embedding self-determination and respect for sort of Aboriginal concepts of family and kinship in the service system response. And yeah, there's probably a lot of work to be done there. I would say in the prevention of family violence space that there's a real lot of leadership from Aboriginal leaders around whole of community engagement, particularly engagement of men in that space, and we can learn a lot from that. But we need to start listening and have those people in positions to do that work.
Thanks, Amy. Steve, I want to throw to you because I know you may have to go on the hour possibly, but and the other three of us will be here for 7 days by the looks of it. I'd just like to just ask a little bit more about, I'll get you to unpack that, the concept of belonging again, Steve, so, and how important it is and the challenges that there must have been in Queensland historically when so many disparate services feed into the one umbrella, particularly in Victoria at the moment where we're going through major reform and people have to lose an identity to then reimagine another identity. And a sense of belonging is hard for people unless they're actually led in a way that is going to make them feel you know, like they are a part of the fabric of the organisation.
Yeah, Steve, I think one of the underlying things with that is we were bringing together, a series of independent services with their own long history and the things attached to that history and identity. One of the things we were clear about in doing that, and this is still a work in progress, by all means, we're not saying we've perfected it and it's the perfect world, but it is around saying, well, we respect the past and respect the identity and the things that make you who you are. We're not trying to remove those, but what we are trying to do is to add another layer of belonging and collaboration, I suppose, and ownership of the common intent to support communities through the whole cycle of preparing and planning for, responding to and recovering. So I think it is important that our role is the dominant feature. So what attracts people to an organisation to serve and make a difference is the thing that binds us together. So focusing in on those things that are common in the first instance, and then having the conversations to sort of go, you know, there's not that great a difference between who we are and what we do and what our intent is, because our purpose is the same, and our the objectives that we're trying to, or the mission that we're on is the same. And when you get to that level of raw conversation about that outcome, those layers peel away. And what we've experienced is in operations that naturally peels away. The community does come to the absolute forefront of the outcome required, and people just bind together. All the barriers are moved, and people get on with the job to do what they need to do. The work is in translating that into the business as usual, day to day, when suddenly people's mindsets or agendas come back into play. And that's part of that is from the leadership point of view, and when I talk leadership, not just the formal roles, but the influences throughout the organisation, having the conversations to challenge when those things that conflict with where we're going or what we're trying to achieve come up, that they're willing, have the courage to have the conversation, and not in the sense correct it, but just have the conversation that improves people's understanding of where we have come from and where we're going to, in the time it takes to do that, knowing that that's very personal for everyone. So I suppose in short, we're trying to personalise it. We're trying to make sure that it is connected to a person's original commitment to the organisation. Everyone was attracted to this organisation for some reason, and it's very common. That purpose was very common. So we're trying to draw back onto that idea and use that as the starting point to really, create that sense of belonging and connectedness that will make us a better organisation.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Amanda, I know you've got to go, so I'd just like to throw to you again and for any final comment.
Look, I'd just like to actually pick up on something Steve said around leadership at all levels. So we know we've got to do disaster risks differently. We can't keep doing the things the way we've done them before and expect a different result. And so one of the key principles we've identified is this enabling leadership at all levels. So it's not just about the people who, stand up as the commissioner or deputy commissioner. It's about people at all levels being able to make a difference and all contributing. And I think AIDA's role within that is to provide that guidance that people can use and apply in their own context, so that we sort of have a consistent way nationally of addressing some of these issues. And I know, Steve, some of those GADPOD resources are designed to do that, your checklists, their guidance documents, really. And what we're saying is, don't keep reinventing the wheel, everyone. There's stuff there that you can use, that you can build on, but, there is some really good materials out there that are informed by research and evidence and good practice from the sector. Use what's available and, really think about how we've got to move forward collectively together. And as I said, do things differently. We can't keep doing what we've done for the last however long and expecting we're going to get a different result. We really need to shift the paradigm, and we need to shift it quite quickly to that building resilience at that whole of community level, because we'll have better outcomes for things like family violence that Amy's spoken of if we do that work at a whole of society level. So that's kind of my parting words to you all. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for the opportunity.
No,
I'm sorry I have to go.
No, that's fantastic. Thanks, Amanda, and thanks for your time too. I just want to, I'll close now because it is 5 past the hour, and I'll just ask Amy, because I want her to flatter Janine in a roundabout sort of way, because I owe her big time. But Amy, how important is our internal networks like Janine, like QFES's ally program for, say, breaking down the risks of structural discrimination creeping into organisations, where you have a visible group of people and protocols in place that actually make people feel included and belong?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. And I think, some of the conversations that have started in the last year around that, and through some of the training and discussions we did with GADPOD as well, were really important for that. And as I said before, I think it's about organisations, industries, government, a bit doing that work about looking into their own backyard, because it's not there's not a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to this. It's really about looking at what are the specific needs of the community and where's your organisation at in terms of its representation and what specific things might it need to do. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, look, pretty much. I just wanted to close on something that was absolutely positive, and we can advise organisations all we like, but unless they've got strong leaders at different levels, like Amanda said, like Janine and like Steve Smith, in organisations, we'll not so much flounder. We'll just exist. And if you're not moving, you're not contemporising. You're sort of stagnant. So look, Amy, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on today. Good luck with your role as you continue as the acting CEO of Respect Victoria. Assistant Commissioner Steve Smith, once again indebted, and Janine, well, what can I say? I owe you a big one. The conference has come to a close with a session that I think is a really important session, talking about how we redefine and reimagine gender in emergency management. As I said, I'll make the recordings available to QFES in a hurry. But the conference will close now, but Helen Riseborough, the CEO of Women's Health in the North, will have some words to say if anyone would like to stay online for Helen to do a formal close now.
Thanks, Steve. And a particular thanks to Steve for really winging these last two sessions this morning and coming in at the last minute with being able to rustle up the wonderful Janine and Steve from Queensland too. So well done, Steve, and everyone on the panel discussions this morning. Good afternoon, everyone. That time has arisen where we're looking at closing. I'm going to make a few closing remarks for this conference, the Gender Justice in Disaster Inspiring Action Conference. It was only 3 weeks ago that I was opening this terrific conference. For those of you who I don't know, my name's Helen Riseborough and I'm the CEO of Women's Health in the North, one of Victoria's women's health services here in Australia. And I've got the privileged role of having not only opened the conference, as I say, a couple of weeks ago, but also closing today and making a few remarks. And firstly, I would like to, along with many others this morning, respectfully acknowledge the wisdom, living culture and unique role of the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we're all meeting. For me, I'm on the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation this morning. But regardless of where we are across Australia, we're on the lands of Aboriginal people, the custodians of this country. And I'd like to acknowledge too that it is Reconciliation Week, National Reconciliation Week here in Australia, with the theme More Than a Word, Reconciliation Takes Action. And I think that has been exemplified by some of the speakers this morning too. I'd like to pay my respects to all First Nations peoples of all of the countries represented at the conference, the elders past and present, and any First Nations people who have been attending. Well, as I say, I've got the privilege of closing this important conference on behalf of the Gender and Disaster Pod, and you've heard a lot about that work of that partnership between Women's Health Goulburn North East, Monash University's Disaster Resilience Initiative and Women's Health in the North. We were blessed with a really committed and hardworking conference organising group made up of the manager of the GAD-Pod, Dr. Deb Parkinson, our research and training coordinator, Jaspreet Kaur, Women's Health Goulburn North East CEO, Amanda Kelly, Monash University's Emeritus Professor Frank Archer, and our colleagues Steve O'Malley from Fire Rescue Victoria, Daryl Taylor from Bioculture, and Leanne Wilson from Happenings Australia. Thank you all for assisting with making this conference a reality. As all of us know, and most people listening today will have been involved in running events like this over the years. Behind the scenes, there's a whole lot of action going on, and the organising group and all of that organising of speakers, presenters, moderators, as well as all the IT tech support behind the scenes is very much appreciated by all of us who have benefited from the conference. Well, I think we've been immensely impressed, and I'm sure you have been too, and inspired by the lineup of speakers and presentations over the last month. The program's been a wonderful mix of an intersection of issues, people, organisations and sectors, all playing a part in bringing a gender lens to critical issues of disaster and contemporary emergency management. We've heard from leaders, researchers, community members, activists, academics, emergency service and community organisations, all bringing unique perspectives and insights to the important issues of gender, emergencies, climate change, intersectionality, representation, Aboriginal land management, discrimination, women in leadership, violence against women and children. It was heartening in 2020 to read recommendation 22.5 from the Federal Government's Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, which reads, develop nationally consistent, pre-agreed recovery programs. Australian state and territory governments should expedite the development of pre-agreed recovery programs, including those that address social needs, such as legal assistance, domestic violence, and also environmental recovery. Welcome too was last week's federal budget with an announcement that funds are going to be made available to address domestic violence aspects of this recommendation. Extending the GADPOD's training and the gender and emergency management guidelines across the whole of Australia is, in my view, one logical step to implementing these recommendations. We at the GADPOD have some terrific plans following this conference in partnership with many of you. Future work alongside AIDA at the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience and the National Red Cross. Future work with emergency management organisations, assisting them to meet their requirements under the new Victorian Gender Equality Act. The Commissioner, Dr. Nikki Vincent, is going to include the new GEM guidelines section on evacuation centres on the Commission's website as one example of things that organisations can do to implement some of these guidelines. We're going to be working in the future with Respect Victoria and following work that we did with that organisation on COVID-19 last year. We've got some future and current plans on the go with Respect Victoria. We've got an ongoing and valued relationship in the United Kingdom with the University College of London's Gender and Disaster Centre Director, Professor Maureen Fordham, who we heard from again this morning. And in the US, the Natural Hazards Centre Director, Laurie Peake in Colorado. A conference outcome statement is currently being researched and written by Naomi Bailey, one of the GADPOD associates, so look out for that. And there's a forthcoming special edition of the Australian Journal of Emergency Management, thanks to AIDA again, and it'll be published next January, and that edition is going to be dedicated to the Gender Justice in Disaster Conference. So again, look out for that terrific edition. Now to a couple of specific thanks, just before I finish off. Firstly, to all the moderators of all of our sessions across the weeks, across all the 7 sessions and the pre-sessions as well, especially to Steve O'Malley and Donna Wheatley and Liam Leonard. You did a sterling job in so many sessions across the conference, not only steering and moderating panels yourselves, but also making presentations yourselves as well. So I know that that was a huge ask, but to all the moderators, thanks very much. A big thanks to AIDA, our supporting partner. Steve mentioned that, and Amanda obviously spoke at our last session. To all the presenters, both international and Australian, in the lead-in sessions and all the conference sessions. We were really, truly inspired. And we did have international speakers from Iceland, Iran, the US, UK, New Zealand, the Pacific, Southeast and South Asia, and from, of course, across Australia. And also many people who have a lived experience shared their hard-won knowledge and insights with us too throughout the conference. Thanks to our GADPOD associates, this conference, of course, wouldn't have actually happened if it wasn't for all of you and the hard work you do in collaboration with us, and particularly around this conference. And of course to Leanne Wilson, from Happenings Australia, who was our practical conference organiser. But I'd also like to thank all of you who participated as audience members across the last month at this conference. We're really proud to share the values base with you in taking action for justice and equity for all people and in all communities. And I'm sure, like me, you're going away inspired and armed with ideas for action and for activism from here on. I suppose, just to quote Maureen from this morning, see you at the biennial reckoning, people. We'll be looking forward to seeing you again. Whether it will be biennial, I'm not sure, but I think that was a terrific, she laid it down, a little challenge there for us, or a challenge for the future. We are looking forward to working and collaborating with all of you into the future. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye for now.